1. How real is reality? 1. From reality to the real. The paradoxes of Objet Petit. Looking awry at Zeno's paradoxes. What is at stake in the endeavor to look awry at theoretical motifs is not just a kind of contrived attempt to illustrate high theory, to make it easily accessible, and thus to spare us the effort of effective thinking. The point is rather that such an exemplification, such a mise en scène of theoretical motifs, renders visible aspects that would otherwise remain unnoticed. Such a procedure already has a respectable line of philosophical predecessors, from late Wittgenstein to Hegel. Is not the basic strategy of Hegel's phenomenology of spirit to undermine a given theoretical position by staging it as an existential subjective attitude, that of asceticism, that of the beautiful soul, etc., and thus to reveal its otherwise hidden inconsistencies? That is, to exhibit the way its very subjective position of enunciation undermines its enunciated, its positive contents. To demonstrate the fecundity of such an approach, let us turn to the first proper philosopher, Permenides, who asserted the sole existence of being as one. What are of interest are the famous paradoxes by means of which Zeno, his disciple, tried to prove his master's thesis a contrario, by disclosing the nonsensical, contradictory consequences that follow from the hypothesis of the existence of multitude and movement. At first sight, which is, of course, that sight which pertains to the traditional historian of philosophy, these paradoxes appear as exemplary cases of pure, hollow, artificial logomachy, contrived logical trifling, attempting to prove an obvious absurdity, something that goes against our most elementary experience. But in his brilliant essay, The Literary Technique of Zeno's Paradoxes, Jean-Claude Milner effectuates a kind of staging of them. He gives sufficient reasons to allow us to conclude that all four of the paradoxes, by means of which Zeno tried to prove the impossibility of movement, originally referred to literary commonplaces. The final form in which these paradoxes became part of our tradition results, moreover, from a typical carnivalesque burlesque procedure of confronting a tragic, noble topic with its vulgar common counterpart, in a manner recalling later Rabelais. Let us take the best known of Zeno's paradoxes, the one about Achilles and the tortoise. Its first point of reference is, of course, the Iliad, Book 22, lines 199 to 200, where Achilles tries in vain to catch up with Hector. This noble reference was then crossed with its popular counterpart, Aesop's fable about the hare and the tortoise. The version universally known today, the one about Achilles and the tortoise, is thus a later condensation of two literary models. The interest of Milner's argument lies not solely in the fact that it proves that Zeno's paradoxes, far from being purely a game of logical reasoning, belong to a precisely defined literary genre. That is, that they use the established literary technique of subverting a noble model by confronting it with its banal comical counterpart. What is of crucial importance from our Lacanian perspective is the very contents of Zeno's literary points of reference. Let us return to the first, most famous paradox mentioned. As already noted, its original literary reference is the following lines from the Iliad. As in a dream, the pursuer never succeeds in catching up with the fugitive whom he is after, and the fugitive likewise cannot ever clearly escape his pursuer. So Achilles that day did not succeed in attaining Hector, and Hector was not able to escape him definitely. What we have here is thus the relation of the subject to the object experienced by every one of us in a dream. The subject, faster than the object, gets closer and closer to it and yet can never attain it. The dream paradox of a continuous approach to an object that nevertheless preserves a constant distance. The crucial feature of this inaccessibility of the object was nicely indicated by Lacan when he stressed that the point is not that Achilles could not overtake Hector or the tortoise. Since he is faster than Hector, he can easily leave him behind, but rather that he cannot attain him. Hector is always too fast or too slow. There is a clear parallel here with the well-known paradox from Brecht's Threepenny Opera. Do not run after luck too arduously, because it might happen that you will overrun it, and that luck will thus stay behind. The libidinal economy of the case of Achilles and the tortoise is here made clear. The paradox stages the relation of the subject to the object cause of its desire, which could never be attained. The object cause is always missed. All we can do is encircle it. In short, the topology of this paradox of Zeno is the paradoxical topology of the object of desire that eludes our grasp, no matter what we may do to attain it. The same may be said of the other paradoxes. Let us go on to the next, the one about the arrow that cannot move because at any given moment it occupies a definite point in space. According to Milner, its model is a scene from the Odyssey, Book 11, lines 606 to 607, in which Heracles is continually shooting an arrow from his bow. He completes the act again and again, but in spite of this incessant activity on his part, the arrow remains motionless. Again, it is almost superfluous to recall how this resembles the well-known dream experience of moving immobility. In spite of all our frenetic activity, we are stuck in the same place. As Milner points out, the crucial characteristic of this scene with Heracles is its location, the infernal world in which Odysseus encounters a series of suffering figures, among them Tantalus and Sisyphus, condemned to repeat the same act indefinitely. The libidinal economy of Tantalus's torments is notable. They clearly exemplify the Lacanian distinction between need, demand, and desire, i.e. the way an everyday object, destined to satisfy some of our needs, undergoes a kind of transubstantiation as soon as it is caught in the dialect of demand and ends up producing desire. When we demand an object from somebody, its use value, the fact that it serves to satisfy some of our needs, eo ipso, becomes a form of expression of its exchange value. The object in question functions as an index of a network of intersubjective relations. If the other complies with our wish, he thereby bears witness to a certain attitude toward us. The final purpose of our demand for an object is thus not the satisfaction of a need attached to it, but confirmation of the other's attitude toward us. When, for example, a mother gives milk to her child, milk becomes a token of her love. The poor Tantalus thus pays for his greed, his striving after exchange value, when every object he obtains loses its use value and changes into a pure, useless embodiment of exchange value. The moment he bites into food, it changes to gold. It is Sisyphus, however, who bears on our interest here. His continuous pushing of the stone up the hill, only to have it roll down again, served, according to Milner, as the literary model for the third of Zeno's paradoxes. We can never cover a given distance x, because to do so, we must first cover half this distance, and to cover half, we must first cover a quarter of it, and so on ad infinitum. A goal once reached always retreats anew. Can we not recognize in this paradox the very nature of the psychoanalytic notion of drive, or more properly, the Lacanian distinction between its aim and its goal? The goal is the final destination, while the aim is what we intend to do, i.e., the way itself. Lacan's point is that the real purpose of the drive is not its goal, full satisfaction, but its aim. The drive's ultimate aim is simply to reproduce itself as drive, to return to its circular path, to continue its path to and from the goal. The real source of enjoyment is the repetitive movement of this closed circuit. Therein consists the paradox of Sisyphus. Once he reaches his goal, he experiences the fact that the real aim of his activity is the way itself, the alternation of ascent and descent. Where do we detect the libidinal economy of the last of Zeno's paradoxes, according to which it follows, from the movement of two equal masses in opposite directions, that half of a certain amount of time equals its double amount? Where do we encounter the same paradoxical experience of an increase in the libidinal impact of an object whenever attempts are made to diminish and destroy it? Consider the way the figure of the Jews functioned in Nazi discourse. The more they were exterminated, eliminated, the fewer their numbers, the more dangerous their remainder became, as if their threat grew in proportion to their diminution in reality. This is again an exemplary case of the subject's relation to the horrifying object that embodies its surplus enjoyment. The more we fight against it, the more its power over us grows. The general conclusion to be drawn from all this is that there is a certain domain in which Zeno's paradoxes are fully valid, the domain of the subject's impossible relation to the object cause of its desire, the domain of the drive that circulates endlessly around it. This is, however, the very domain Zeno is obliged to exclude as impossible in order that the reign of the philosophical one can establish itself. That is, the exclusion of the real of the drive and the object around which it circulates is constitutive of philosophy as such, which is why Zeno's paradoxes, by means of which he tries to prove the impossibility and consequently the non-existence of movement and multitude, are the reverse of the assertion of one, the immovable being, in Parmenides, the first proper philosopher. Perhaps we can now understand what Lacan meant when he said that the object small a is what philosophical reflection lacks in order to be able to locate itself, i.e., to ascertain its nullity. Goal and aim in fantasy. In other words, what Zeno excludes is the very dimension of fantasy, insofar as, in Lacanian theory, fantasy designates the subject's impossible relation to to the object cause of its desire. Fantasy is usually conceived as a scenario that realizes the subject's desire. This elementary definition is quite adequate, on condition that we take it literally. What the fantasy stage is not a scene in which our desire is fulfilled, fully satisfied, but on the contrary, a scene that realizes, stages the desire as such. The fundamental point of psychoanalysis is that desire is not something given in advance, but something that has to be constructed, and it is precisely the role of fantasy to give the coordinates of the subject's desire, to specify its object, to locate the position the subject assumes in it. It is only through fantasy that the subject is constituted as desiring. Through fantasy, we learn how to desire. To exemplify this crucial theoretical point, let us take a famous science fiction short story, Robert Sheckley's Store of the Worlds. Mr. Wayne, the story's hero, visits the old and mysterious Tompkins, who lives alone in a shack, ruined and filled with decaying waste in an abandoned part of town. Rumor has it that, by means of a special kind of drug, Tompkins is capable of transposing people into a parallel dimension where all their desires are fulfilled. To pay for this service, one was required to hand over to Tompkins one's most valuable material goods. After finding Tompkins, Wayne engages him in conversation. The former maintains that most of his clients return from their experience well satisfied. They do not, afterward, feel deceived. Wayne, however, hesitates, and Tompkins advises him to take his time and think things over before making up his mind. All the way home, Wayne thinks about it, but at home, his wife and son are waiting for him. And soon he is caught up in the joys and small troubles of family life. Almost daily, he promises himself that he will visit old Tompkins again and afford himself the experience of the fulfillment of his desires. But there is always something to be done, some family matter that distracts him and causes him to put off his visit. First, he has to accompany his wife to an anniversary party. Then his son has problems in school. In summer, there are vacations, and he has promised to go sailing with his son. Fall brings its own new preoccupations. The whole year goes by in this way, with Wayne having no time to take the decision, although in the back of his mind he is constantly aware that sooner or later he will definitely visit Tompkins. Time passes thus until he awakes suddenly in the shack beside Tompkins, who asks him kindly, "So, how do you feel now? Are you satisfied?" Embarrassed and perplexed, Wayne mumbles, yes, of course," gives him all his worldly possessions, a rusty knife, an old can, and a few other small articles, and leaves quickly, hurrying between the decaying ruins so that he will not be too late for his evening ration of potatoes. He arrives at his underground shelter before darkness, when flocks of rats come out from their holes and reign over the devastation of nuclear war. The story belongs, of course, to post-catastrophe science fiction, which describes everyday life after nuclear war, or some similar event, has caused the disintegration of our civilization. The aspect that interests us here, however, is the trap into which the reader of the story necessarily falls, the trap upon which the whole effectiveness of the story is based, and in which the very paradox of desire consists. We mistake for postponement of the thing itself what is already the thing itself, We mistake for the searching and indecision proper to desire what is, in fact, the realization of desire. That is to say, the realization of desire does not consist in its being fulfilled, fully satisfied. It coincides rather with the reproduction of desire as such, with its circular movement. Wayne realized his desire precisely by transposing himself, in a hallucination, into a state that enabled him to postpone indefinitely his desire's full satisfaction, i.e., into a state that reproduced the lack constitutive of desire. We can in this way also grasp the specificity of the Lacanian notion of anxiety. Anxiety occurs not when the object cause of desire is lacking. It is not the lack of the object that gives rise to anxiety, but, on the contrary, the danger of our getting too close to the object, and thus losing the lack itself. Anxiety is brought on by the disappearance of desire. Where exactly, in this futile circular movement, is the objet A? The hero of Dashiell Hammett's Maltese Falcon, Sam Spade, narrates the story of his being hired to find a man who had suddenly left his settled job and family and vanished. Spade is unable to track him down, but a few years later the man is spotted in another city, where he lives under an assumed name and leads a life remarkably similar to the one he had fled when a beam from a construction site fell and narrowly missed hitting him on the head. In Lacanian terms, this beam became for him the mark of the world's inconsistency, S. Bardet. In spite of the fact that his new life so closely resembles the old, he is firmly convinced that his beginning again was not in vain, i.e., that it was well worth the trouble to cut his ties and begin a new life. Here we see the function of the objet petit a at its purest. From the point of view of wisdom, the break is not worth the trouble. Ultimately, we always find ourselves in the same position from which we have tried to escape, which is why, instead of running after the impossible, we must learn to consent to our common lot and to find pleasure in the trivia of our everyday life. Where do we find the objet petit a? The objet a is precisely that surplus, that elusive make-believe, that drove the man to change his existence. In reality, it is nothing at all, just an empty surface. His life after the break is the same as before, but because of it, the break is nonetheless well worth the trouble.